invitation, and thank you all. Oh, and thank you all for being here. Okay, I got it. I'm being recorded. What I will talk about today is this Sherpa project. And before I come into any of the content, a bit of background and metadata on Sherpa. Sherpa was a EU project. It finished last year. It ran 3.5 years. So it started in May 2018, if I remember that right. And given the way EU projects run, that means we submitted the proposal about a year before that. So we're talking about the summer 2017 when we submitted the proposal. And that means we wrote it in 2016, 2017. Now that's ancient history, of course, but if you do remember that, you may remember that AI at the time wasn't really as much of a big buzzword as it is at the moment. At the time, we had other things. There were, for example, data ethics was a much stronger term. And the Sherpa project was written in response to a call for thinking about digital technology and its ethical and social implications in general. What we therefore chose in terms of conceptual basis was something that we called smart information systems. And that's something that you'll see popping up throughout my presentation here. And by smart information systems, we meant those types of technologies that build on AI, but also as well, most current AI does includes big data analytics, but it's also sort of embedded into broader social systems. And that's really a core aspect to the narrative here. So we were trying to look at what are ethical and social and human rights aspects in particular of these new technologies, of these emerging technologies, which are based on AI, but which aim to go beyond that. Now, during the lifetime of the project, a lot has happened. Certainly the whole AI debate has exploded. The European Commission has proposed the AI Act, which is now currently being debated, which all happened throughout this project, all completely unexpected for us. We had no idea these things were going to happen, which raised lots of challenges for us. So a key challenge in this world is that we wanted to say something that's non-obvious and that's relatively novel. And what I'm going to present here today is an attempt to frame our work in ways that fulfill this criterion. So that are novel, that are not painfully obvious, that not everybody has said before. Right, so that's the background. And before I go into the content of the talk, a quick introduction of the center that Benjamin has briefly introduced. So we've been around for a long time. We were established at the Montfort University in 1996. So we've celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. And we've always been looking at ethical and social aspects of IT, long before that became popular. And I joined them in 2003, and I've been heading the group since 2010. We are reasonably big, so we have about 25 members of staff, probably about half of them teaching active, and the other half third-party funded researchers. We've got a bunch of international links with visiting profs and so on. We run one of the long-standing conference series in the area of ethics and computing, so the Ethicomp series. Next one is going to take place, I think, next month in Finland. We run a couple of journals, and we have a bunch of projects, and Sherpa is one of those. Right, so on to the content. The Sherpa project wanted to come up with an understanding of ethical, social, and human rights aspects of these smart information systems. And the question is how best to do that. And the way we chose to approach this is through a variety of activities, but primarily in the beginning, a set of case studies and a set of scenarios. So the case studies were meant to cover current use of these smart information systems in relevant application areas. So we try to define areas where we would expect these systems to be used, and then we try to identify organizations that actually made use of them, and we undertook case study research on them. So we interviewed them, we looked at background material and so on, and we did 10 of those. So we had the various, and we tried to spread them as broadly as possible through various application fields. So we looked at a company using IoT. We had at least one government-related one. So we had smart city, but we also looked at smart information systems and other government applications. We interacted with a large agricultural company to look at how they make use of these technologies. We had smart cities. We had the case study from science. Actually, the case study we took for science is the Human Brain Project, which I'm also part of, as an example of a project that is pretty big and makes use of smart information systems. We looked at an insurance. We had exchanges with an energy and utilities company. We looked at media, retail and trade, and manufacturing. So we tried to look all across the place. Now, if you're interested in any of those, they're all published. You can all find them on the website. They're all published as separate case studies. I'm not going to go into detail any of them. It's just background and in terms of where we got our ideas from. Secondly, we wanted to look beyond current practices, and we wanted to look at what's likely to happen in the near-term future. So we developed a set of scenarios, and we try to pick scenarios in areas where we know things are already happening, that they are on the cusp of becoming relevant, but where we expect further developments to go on. And these are the 5 areas of the scenarios. So we looked at law enforcement, predictive policing, education, the use of technology in higher, but also in primary and secondary education. We looked at impacts on warfare, autonomous vehicles, and deep fakes, mimicking technologies. Again, these are all published. In these cases, for each of those scenarios, we had a stakeholder workshop and went through several iterations of describing what we expect these technologies to do. Now, all of this was meant to address our first challenge, and this is going back to the logic of the project. So in the project, we said that we want to address a number of challenges. For each of these challenges, we've come up with a set of methodologies, and all together they were meant to give us the insights of the project. So as you've already seen, there are the 10 case studies that would help us to identify what the current views are on what the ethics and human rights implications of these smart information systems are. So we did case studies, the scenarios. We also looked at cyber threats. We looked at the literature on ethical impacts, and we also looked at the literature on current human rights implications of these technologies. Now, the idea was that this was going to give us an overview of what the discourse is. So what are people worried about? What are ethical and social issues? And then the second challenge for us was to think about how we broaden this debate. So it's clear that a consortium, so we were, I think, 11 partners, which is now reasonably big in terms of academic research, but it's not huge in terms of representativeness of broader stakeholder groups. So we created a stakeholder group board with about 20 people on them. We did a bunch of interviews across various types of areas. We did an online survey with somewhere around 300 respondents, and we did a Delphi study. So the idea is to make sure that we had a broader understanding of the debate. Now, in light of what we think these issues are, and in light of broader input into the interpretations of those issues, the next challenge we faced was, what can we do about them? So what are the options in order to ensure that ethical concerns are addressed, that human rights issues are properly taken into consideration? These were the 5 main points that we have had in the proposal. So we developed a set of guidelines for research and innovation of smart information systems, which in the end translated into ethics by design guidelines. And these were developed in collaboration with another project, another EU project, the Siena project. They've been finalized, and they actually now have been adopted by the European Commission as guidelines for AI research as part of the ethics review. So if you want to apply for an EU grant that has AI in its title, then you're very likely to be asked to explain how you're going to address the ethical issues that may arise from that. And as part of the guidance, the EU will give you a reference to some of the work we've done here in terms of how this can be addressed. So that's the first one. Then we looked at regulatory options. So again, coming back to this, we wrote this, we had these ideas long before the EU AI Act became a thing. And to some degree, it was beneficial to us that the EU started legislating during the lifetime of the project, but it also sort of interfered with our logic of the project because they didn't follow our timelines. We looked at standardization, whether and what role standards can play. So we had the Dutch Standards Organization as part of the consortium. We looked at technical options and interventions, predominantly in the area of cybersecurity, because F-Secure was partner in the project, and they were really interested in the cybersecurity implications of smart systems. And we looked at possible terms of reference for a regulator of AI, so that you could see this as part of the regulatory option, but we specifically looked at what a regulator might look like. Having then come up with our array of possible ways of dealing with these issues, we then went through a phase of testing, which basically consisted of a bunch of focus groups. So we did focus groups in various bits of Europe to check whether the suggestions we've come up with were viable and made sense to people. And then finally, we had the challenge of communicating and going beyond just the academic activities and to make sure that our ideas are taken up. And arguably today is, even though it's post-project, what today to me would count as one of these activities. So we have the normal dissemination communication. If you have the time, I would encourage you to look at the Sherpa website, because we did have an artist in residence who did some really interesting things. So on the Sherpa reference website, there's a link to another website called Sherpa Pieces, and Timon Chep, that's the name of the artist, did some really cool things. So among them, he developed a water gun that you could target on particular types of population. So you could, for example, make it fire only at men or only at women or only at old people or so on. To give an indication, and that was based on autonomous weaponry that already exists, and he tried to translate this into a playful way into something that you can relate to. We also did a really interesting facial recognition system. So if you go to the website, there's a subsection called How Normal Am I?, which will analyze your facial features using publicly available models. So it will tell you, for example, how beautiful you are and how attractive other people think you are. And so it's a very interesting approach to these systems. And finally, we also had a set of advocacy activities. So we explicitly reached out to various policymakers, mostly on the European level, and tried to engage them in conversations about these topics. So that was the Sherpa project. That was sort of the logic of the project, and I'll now go into some of the content. And now I will move away from the smart information systems terminology and use the term AI more, mostly because it sort of superseded our project. And these days people talk about AI, and smart information systems did not get entrenched in the way that AI is. They're not identical, but they're fairly close. And AI raises a number of conceptual questions, which I will now look into. So what is AI? This is the European Union white paper definition as a collection of technologies that combine data, algorithms, computing power. Very wide, pretty much anything you can think of. This is a more typical academic one, where you say combines various human behaviors that typically require intelligence, such as perception, memory, emotions, and so on. I'll come back to the definition of AI in a minute, but an interesting question to ask is, why is AI developed? What's it used for? What are the purposes of AI? And if you look at the AI literature, then this one is the dominant one. So if you read a textbook on AI, typically they tell you that it produces efficiency, it can optimize it. In the end, that then often translates into benefits for the organization, and that typically means profits. And there are other purposes of AI, however, that are worth being aware of. One of them is social control. And while the primary example of that is probably the Chinese social credit scoring, there are lots of others. So if you read Zuboff, for example, her concept of surveillance capitalism is really heavily predicated on this idea of AI being used for social control. And then what we are suggesting here as sort of the ethical alternative is human flourishing. A lot of the work we've done in Sherpa was then based on human flourishing as the ethical concept that tries to bring together the various ethical discourses. The way I've drawn them here as a Venn diagram shows that these purposes are not necessarily contradictory. It may very well be that human flourishing is supported by efficiencies and optimization. And I think the COVID pandemic has shown that social control is sometimes required for human flourishing. So they're not contradictory, but I think that you can identify different emphases. And the point here is that human flourishing is something that should be at the heart of AI if the purpose is to promote ethical concerns. Now, coming back to the concept of AI, this is an attempt by Elsevier, the academic publisher, to condense our insights or the academic insights into AI. And you probably can't read this. So what they've done, Elsevier, as you probably know, is a big academic publisher. They, among many other things, they own Scopus, the big database, which has, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of papers in them. And they did an analysis of the AI literature, a bibliometric analysis where they try to tease out, using AI systems actually, what AI stands for. And they, in the end, they came up with, I think, 800 something keywords, and those are the things that you see here on around this circle. So these are all individual keywords that the academic literature uses when it discusses AI, and you can see that they then managed to cluster those. So they clustered these in, I think, 8 main clusters. And those would include some of the ones you would expect, such as machine learning, such as natural language processing, but also some that are possibly less current at the moment, such as fuzzy logic. Now, the reason I bring this up here and why I find this interesting is that this analysis shows that there isn't actually a core of AI that all AI adheres to. It's more a family. So AI is a family of concepts, a family of technologies, but there's very little that all of them, if anything, that all of them have in common. Now that, of course, raises a challenge if you want to talk about the ethics of AI. And therefore, we went back, and this is what we did as part of our empirical work. We looked at, well, what do people actually refer to when we talk to them about AI? So what's the concept of AI in use rather than a top-down definition? And we identified 3 different aspects of that. So one is machine learning, the current focus of the whole AI debate, and with the various types of techniques behind it, artificial neural networks and deep learning, and you name them. Classical example of narrow AI. The second thing people refer to when they talk about AI is this embedding of a particular piece of kit in a broader socio-technical system. So we call them here converging socio-technical systems. Examples would be things like the use of AI in fraud detection systems in insurance. There is a bit of machine learning somewhere in the middle, but there's a lot of stuff around it where the AI itself is only a minor component of a broader system that does something to the world, that interacts with the rest of the world. And then finally, we have general AI or artificial general intelligence, or whatever you want to call it, those things that are truly human-like, which don't exist and may never exist, but which are very strongly emphasized and referenced in discussions about AI. Now, if you look at those three groups, then you see that they all have different characteristics and different features, and that these features and characteristics translate into particular type of ethical issues. So machine learning at the moment, the way we see it is opaque. It's difficult to understand what happens within it. It is therefore unpredictable, also partly because it learns, it changes the state of the system over time, and requires a lot of data for training purposes and for validation purposes. Now, the converging socio-technical systems are characterized by the fact that they have social impact. So my fraud detection example now may, for example, lead to a fraud investigation, which now clearly may have strong social impact. They are often seen to be manipulative, so they manipulate what people can and want to do, and they are perceived to have a certain level of autonomy. Now, I'm not saying that in a strong philosophical sense, but they do stuff without immediate user intervention. And then finally, you have artificial general intelligence, which raises questions around intelligence in general, about what it means to be human, about what we can know and what we can't know. Now, these three groups translate into sets of ethical concerns. So on the one hand, we have specific issues that relate to machine learning. Then we have broader questions about how we live in this world that is very much pervaded by digital technologies. And then finally, we have what I call here metaphysical questions, or you might call them general philosophical questions. So examples of the specific issues coming out of machine learning, because of the features of what machine learning can do and is at the moment, are things like bias and discrimination, or the idea that there may be bias in algorithms, there may be bias in data sets, in models that get translated from the data and so on. There are questions around security, there are questions around data protection that are based on the data requirements of these systems. And when you look at the broader socio-technical systems, there are questions around autonomy of the system itself, but also the autonomy of us, of potential users, of people in society. What can and can we not do because of these systems? There are questions around power, about political power, Cambridge Analytica, primary example, but also economic power. There are questions around what does it do to the future of warfare, who benefits, who pays for these things. So bigger societal questions. And then on the metaphysical level, so these are around artificial general intelligence, there are questions around will these things actually become intelligent or possibly even super intelligent? Will there be the singularity point? And what does that actually mean about how we see ourselves as human beings? Now, for some of these issues, I think there are probably ways of conceptualizing them and addressing them. So there are technical, legal, other remedies. So explainable AI is an example of a research field that is specifically targeting some of these machine learning concerns. Others aren't really capable of being resolved on technical level. Questions of the power of Google and Apple over all of us. This is not a technical question. These are political questions. They call for policy and political interventions. And then there are some which may not be subject to any sort of resolution anyway, because they are fundamental philosophical questions. So you see that there are very different types of technologies involved and very different concerns that these may raise. And what I'm trying to do now is build this picture of complexity. Now, in light of what the concerns are that we encounter in this AI debate, it's worth looking at what has been suggested to do about it. So what are mitigation measures? And I'm suggesting 4 different groups. Now you can carve this up differently if you want to. The point really is to look at the range of possibilities. So I'm looking at policy and regulatory options, I'm looking at what an organization can do, technical options, and what an individual can do. And to give you a few examples, now on the policy side and the regulatory side, we could have specific regulation, the EU AI Act, primary example, but there are also lots of other regulatory interventions from human rights law to competition law that could be relevant. What can organizations do? while organizations already have a lot of stuff in place that can be applied to AI, such as impact assessments, such as risk management, quality assurance, CSR or CDR, as I should now say, having just encountered this concept. So organizations can or already have an array of options which they might want to specify for AI. There are lots of technical interventions, so specific security approaches, for example, data protection, I put here under technical because it has there's precedent on how to do it in practice. You can use standards, you can develop guidance, methodologies, and so on. And then finally, as an individual involved in this, you can look at various, many ethical frameworks that exist at this point. You can look at professional guidance, try to apply methodologies, and so on. So these are types of mitigations that are being discussed and proposed. Who is supposed to take these into consideration? In this case, I'm suggesting 3 groups. Again, you could carve it up differently if you want to. So I'm suggesting there's policy, there are organizations, and there are different types of individuals. So on the policy level, and now given that we were an EU project, we have a very strong focus on the EU. So the EU would be a key player, but you also have national policymakers, you have research funders, you have regulators, you have international bodies, OECD, UNESCO, they all are in on the game of AI. You have lots of different types of organizations. So you have the ones that build the stuff, so the developers, the deployers, but you also have other types of organizations, such as media, standardization bodies, civil society organizations, and educators, us, universities. And finally, you have various types of individuals who, of course, make up all the other stakeholders, but who also may want to play a role as individuals, for example, as experts, as developers, but also as users, activists, or possibly as affected non-users. So where does that lead us? So what I've tried to do now is sort of paint a picture of the complexity of the landscape. And I think it's fairly clear that there is no single one thing you can do to address all of these issues. So there is no magic bullets. And that has to do with the epistemic complexity to just understand the landscape, to get valid knowledge about it. But it also has to do with the fact that there is already a large scale of existing responsibilities that cover bits of this landscape. And of course, there's technical progress. That means things move on and the capabilities of the technologies change rapidly. So what societies need to do in order to address these questions will probably be some sort of intelligent mix of different options. So there's no one thing I can't say, do this and you'll be fine. But it is a process of thinking about what are most appropriate ways of doing this. And that's where we came up with this metaphor of an ecosystem to describe the landscape and to think about what interventions would make sense. So this is then the sort of the attempt to say something that, at least at the time, wasn't as obvious as it may look now, that we want to or that it would be desirable to move towards an ecosystem of artificial intelligence that would promote human flourishing. Now, how would you do that? First, you need to think about what is an ecosystem, and a lot of this part of the talk has been taken from the innovation ecosystems literature, which you may be familiar with. I think most innovation ecosystems authors sit in business schools. So we look through what does this literature say about ecosystems and how you can deal with them. So ecosystems have unclear boundaries. They are open to their environments. So there is those semi-permeable boundaries. One of the reasons why the ecosystem metaphor seems to be quite popular in the business world is that it explains change. Evolution is used as a explanation for change over time. You have co-evolution and mutual learning. So if you look at the members of an ecosystem, they evolve together and they can learn from each other, even though they, of course, also compete. And so the actors within the ecosystems are interdependent. And the relationship between those actors are complex. So they can compete, they can collaborate. And as a consequence, it's very difficult to make linear predictions on cause and effect within an ecosystem. But that's true for systems theory in general, but also for ecosystems. So if you want to influence, to shape an ecosystem, what would you need to do? So what requirements would an intervention need to fulfill? Firstly, the ecosystem would need to be delineated clearly. It's got to be clear what you're talking about. This may be a geographical delimitation, but in the world of AI, this might also be a conceptual. So what type of AI are you looking at, or a technical, what technical implementation are you interested in? In order for an ecosystem to be capable of being affected, of being shaped, it needs a knowledge base. So an AI ecosystem would need to clearly have some technical knowledge, but it needs to go beyond that. There needs to be some conceptual knowledge, some procedural knowledge, and this knowledge base needs to be able to maintain and update itself. So there needs to be a capacity building component to it. And finally, an ecosystem needs a governance structure. And the idea here is that the governance within the ecosystem needs to be adaptive, it needs to be flexible, it needs to be capable of reacting to changes, it needs to be able to learn. And as a consequence, we've put this meta responsibility idea here. The idea is that the ecosystem needs to be able to allocate responsibilities that already exist in ways that are mutually conducive. So these, we suggest, are requirements for an intervention to move an ecosystem in the direction of human flourishing. And that then brings us to our recommendations. So what needs to be done in order, or what are components of this intelligent mix that I talked about earlier that would allow moving the AI ecosystem into the direction of human flourishing? So we're suggesting three main groups of recommendations: one around delimitation, the second one around governance, and the final one around knowledge. So the limitation only has one recommendation, which is provide conceptual clarity. What is it that's at issue? What is the technology? What are the boundaries of what's being talked about? In terms of governance, we are suggesting that a regulatory framework is required. This might be the AI Act in the EU, it might be national legislation, it might be other legislation. We're suggesting that there needs to be a gatekeeper. There needs to be an organization that looks after the boundaries, that implements the regulation. In this case, we've called it an EU agency because we're an EU project. Again, this could be on a national level. And we're suggesting on an organizational level, it might be very helpful to have an AI ethics officer, somebody who sits within an organization who can bridge the technical and the social side of the AI debate. With regards to knowledge, we're suggesting that it would be helpful to have a baseline for an AI impact assessment. We're suggesting that ethics by design guidelines should be developed and implemented. We're suggesting that training and education have an important role to play. Standardization similarly can support all these activities, and that specific security measures need to be put in place. So these are our 9 different recommendations in those 3 groups. What's important to note is that while each of them, and you can look them all up on our website, and there's a lot more detail on where they come from and what they mean in practice. But what's important to keep in mind is that you should look at them as a systems approach. So you should look at them in conjunction. So the different groups build on each other. So the delimitation, for example, is required to build the knowledge base, but the knowledge base then also says what exactly are the boundaries. Governance structures may incentivize the creation of knowledge, whereas the knowledge then also will inform the governance structures. The governance will need to be based on the delimitation of the concept. So these groups hang together. The same is true for the recommendations within those groups. So a regulatory framework, for example, might call for an ethics officer. It might establish an agency. If you have an ethics by design system or an ethics by design methodology, it would probably include or might build on impact assessment. It would require training. It might build on standardization and implement security. And finally, there are also relationships between those individuals across the groups. So if you had an AI ethics officer, that will probably be a position that would require a certain level of training. A regulatory framework might mandate an AI impact assessment, that sort of stuff. So here's a different conceptualization of the same argument. So you see here our groups of recommendations and the individual recommendations. So this is what you see on the Sherpa website. And that really is our attempt to come up with a positive contribution to the AI ethics debate, which has become large and unwieldy. And we hope that these suggestions are useful and practical. And as I've already indicated, some of them are already being implemented to a certain degree, whereas others are still at an earlier stage. And finally, if you want to see any of this in any more detail, so I've written a book around this, which you can actually read for free. It's an open access book, very kindly paid for by the European Commission. And that's it. Thank you very much.